If you look at limitation of liability provisions compared to indemnification provisions, there are a lot of similarities, which is why I like to cover them kind of around the same time. Now, in both of these, you have two parties who have significantly different interests and approaches based on their position in the transaction. As we talked about with indemnification, if you are the party more likely to cause claims, you're going to look for more limited indemnification obligations and making sure that you have a lot of exclusions for things that are contributed by the customer. We talked a lot about the different approaches that a vendor and a customer would have to negotiating an indemnity. Well, the same is true for limitations of liability. We use the same kind of likelihoods to decide how to approach our limitations of liability. If each party has a similar likelihood of causing damages, then we try to approach it in a balanced way. But in most deals, like we talked about with indemnity, the vendor has more obligations. So the vendor is more likely to cause damages to the customer. And the customer traditionally has less obligations. So is less likely to cause damages and more likely to suffer those damages. So the customer and vendors typically have these different approaches to limitations of liability. Again, very similar to indemnity, where the vendor, the one more likely to cause damage, is going to want to keep a fixed cap. It's going to want to protect itself from too much liability for this counterparty and making sure the liability is proportionate to the transaction. Whereas the customer is going to be looking for access to more remedies and payments by the vendor if something goes wrong. It doesn't want to be stuck holding the bag and having no recourse for damages that it suffered. So we're following that same kind of dynamic. The other way they're similar is there is no one right answer. There is no one correct way to do a limitation liability. Yes, there are industry standards. Yes, there are approaches that a lot of people use, but the right limitation liability is whatever the two parties will agree to. And at the end of the day, you're doing the best you can to protect your own company's interests and get the deal done. Another similarity is that limitation liabilities only come out when something really bad happens. Indemnities only are looked at, are brought up, are relied upon when there is a claim covered by the indemnity, which typically doesn't happen very often. The same with limitations liability. We don't even look at it, even with day-to-day problems and issues. Nobody cares what the limitation liability is. They only care when the value of the harm and the damages suffered is starting to get up there, or your side is assessing its exposure either as a damage sufferer or a damage causer and wants to get a handle on what rights you have and what options and what strategies you should approach. I can tell you it is so common in my career that I found myself in a room discussing a problem and immediately we would pull out the limitation liability. Very, very rarely did we ever look at an indemnity. They're just not that common for most B2B transactions. It just doesn't come up that much. Again, not maybe construction, maybe in some high-end IP things it happens more often, but for day-to-day commercial contracts that most of us are doing, there aren't a lot of indemnification demands and indemnification cases. But I can tell you almost every single time a problem with a vendor or a customer got escalated and it was of any significance, we pulled out that limitation liability to check our exposure so that we could better inform the business teams about their options and their risk. So how are they different? Well, they're different because these are a lot shorter and simpler than indemnification, which I think is a good thing. It's also why I like these much better. Indemnifications with limitations of liability, the parts are much more straightforward. and shorter. Even in my biggest deals, those are the differences and similarities between indemnification and limitations of liability.